Hello, everyone, from CompSTD's 1100 Intro to Humanities. Welcome to our one-time podcast, Into the Eye of the Storm, Exploring Inequalities in Hurricane Relief Efforts. My name is John Hyre. This is Olivia Benvenuto and Emily Arena. Please introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Olivia.
Hi, I'm Emily.
Great to have you guys on today. So, as I was saying, today we're going to be talking about the strife injustices involved with something that a lot of people wouldn't really think about typically is injustices involved with natural disasters. So more specifically, we're going to be bringing up two very recent natural disasters that a lot of you actually may know, either personally or through the news or through social media. But today we're going to be talking about Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico that hit Puerto Rico in September of 2017, and Hurricane Ida that hit Louisiana in August of 2021. So first and foremost, everyone has their own conception of what they think a hurricane can do, the kind of damage that could be done. We see things on TV a lot about grueling images of houses being flooded, roofs coming off of houses. My first question for you guys, what do you think, what really comes to your mind when you think of the damage that comes from a hurricane?
I think specifically, I think of the lives that are lost and, obviously how sad that is, but also just like the damage that it can do to like cities. And, you see floods and trees on houses and a lot of other damage, down power lines or anything like that. And it's really sad to look at and, see how much those people that are in those areas are struggling after, such a horrible event that happened.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely, when I think of a hurricane, I just think of, like trees falling on houses, people without power for weeks and months even, and just like the flooding. And I also think of like the lack of food and water sources for everyone. I think that's also like a really big part of hurricanes that are this big and do this much damage.
Absolutely. I tend to agree with you where, once again, it's a lot of the things we see in social media where you'll see trees on power lines. You'll see videos of people picking through the wreckage. Any natural disaster is going to create these situations for people that it's an event you can never anticipate, right?
Yeah.
If you let me share my screen here real quick, I'd actually like to show you a specific example from Hurricane Maria. That of Puerto Rico, of a small town or neighborhood in Puerto Rico after Maria. So here you can see, do you see the image that I
see it?
So here you can see the image. I mean, as you can see here, these are what would be considered modest homes in Puerto Rico. There are a lot of neighborhoods that look exactly like this, but this image was taken less than a week after the hurricane hit. As you can see, there are a lot of roofs torn from buildings, a lot of people's livelihoods completely destroyed because they have nowhere to live. A lot of these places that you see, there's things you can't see, the damage is done, the structural damage done to some of these houses, some of the flooding that has occurred here. But what this means for these people, obviously, is they can't reliably live in these houses. They're going to do it anyway because they have nowhere else to go. But this is just an inkling into the amount of damage that was caused among the entire island in Puerto Rico, really, which is it's really a sad thing to see. That leads me into my second question. So we're also going to be talking about today some of the injustices involved with a natural disaster like this. So before we delve deeper into our topic, what inequalities do you think victims of a natural disaster could potentially face, especially in Puerto Rico and in Louisiana?
I think for me, like when I hear about the Hurricane Ida and what has happened in Louisiana, I just know that there are a lot of there's environmental racism going on, and there are when people are in lesser communities that aren't as wealthy, don't have as much money, they definitely are hit a lot harder than the people who do have more money to be able to fix their homes and get more access to food and water and just that kind of thing. It's definitely, I think, the biggest part. Also in Puerto Rico that has happened. I know Puerto Rico isn't considered one of the most wealthy places, and definitely a lot of the areas there were hit hard with just not having access to the resources they need.
Yeah, I think
Absolutely.
everything that you just touched on like is basically the gist. There's a lot of inequalities and how like the how people react to the hurricanes in some of those areas, because some people don't have access to power or food or water for a really long time after, and it's really sad, because they're already struggling because Puerto Rico isn't the most wealthy area.
Absolutely. I agree with everything you say. Very good introduction into what we're going to be further talking about, what you both discussed in terms of inequality in utilities that are being repaired, inequality in the food and water that's being distributed to these communities and everything. You see on a huge level, both in Puerto Rico and in Louisiana, that people, more privileged people who have money and who have the authority and the resources to be able to do these kinds of things, they get the water first, they get the food first. And then you'll see images and hear of stories of people in rural parts of Puerto Rico where they can't even go to the supermarket because the roads are blocked, right? But delving further into both of these hurricanes, first we're going to talk about some of the key facts of Hurricane Maria. So as we know, Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico on September 20th of 2017. And 4 months after the hurricane, 40% of the population still didn't have access to power. This also left 40% of the schools on the island without electricity, and 10%, 4 months after the hurricane, 10% of people still didn't have the bare essential water that they needed to get. It's been estimated that there have been around $45 to $95 billion in damages in Puerto Rico between infrastructures and personal property damage, and a final official death toll from the Puerto Rican government of 2,975 Puerto Ricans dead from Hurricane Maria. Olivia did some research on a Hurricane Ida that hit Louisiana. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's just like one fact that really stood out to me. Well, Hurricane Ida hit Louisiana in August of 2021, which was very recently. And some of the areas were without power for 6 weeks. And I just think that's like very crazy to think about, like now in a time where we have so many resources, especially here in the United States, that it's possible for people to be without power for that long.
Right.
And also, like, there were 2 months left in hurricane season. So if another hurricane were to hit, like, it would just be terrible.
Catastrophic results.
Yeah.
So that kind of leads directly into one of the main topics of what we're talking about, which I'm going to refer to as environmental justice, is seeing the inequalities here. As de Beauvoir would state, in her theory of one versus the other, a lot of these situations, in both of these situations, the one is the wealthy people in places like Dorado, the Ritz-Carlton Reserve in Puerto Rico, where 3 weeks after the hurricane hit, they were already dancing. They had live music. They had drinks during a temporary prohibition of the island, actually, versus the people inland who were automatically considered the other. So we can further explore how environmental justice, how we can achieve that. One of the quotes actually from this article that we pulled in describing the environmental injustice in Puerto Rico states, achieving environmental justice requires more than redistribution, participation, or recognition. It demands undoing dominant power relations and reimagining and practicing equality. From that, Emily, could you describe the main problems that we're talking about today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that when you said the words environmental justice, I think what at least stood out to me is like the inequalities that we face in these circumstances, which I think mainly I think a lot of the problem is that, like, with classism and racism, and we see that a lot in these like natural disasters, and it's unfortunate, but I think we can define classism as like a particular injustice or prejudice against a group of people, like within a specific social class. And racism would be more of a prejudice or discrimination of a group of people based on the ethnic group or racial group that they identify as. And I think that both of these problems like are very prevalent in our topic of environmental justice, especially like both the hurricanes like present systemic injustices of how like poor individuals or like people of lower socioeconomic statuses and minorities face less priority for hurricane relief, which is really unfortunate.
Truly.
Mm-hmm.
truly. Well, moving forward from that, thank you for those definitions and for defining what we're talking about here today. I'd like to bring up some other statistics here from Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, and how they kind of it highlights exactly what you're talking about here in terms of classism and how some people get unequal treatment compared to other people. So a month after the hurricane, there were nearly a million people in Puerto Rico who still didn't have water, a month after the hurricane, which once again, this is a basic building block of life. There were a lot of urban versus rural inequalities, and urban can be equated to the wealthy class in Puerto Rico, while the rural communities they're the more impoverished people, the other, as we'd like to say. 80% of the metro area had water by about a month into the recovery efforts, but only 45% of people in the western parts of rural areas of Puerto Rico had water, and only 32% of rural areas in the north part of Puerto Rico had access to clean water. The government at this point, they recommended that all water from the tap should be boiled before consumption. So this also shows that there were only about 30 of the 50 water treatment plants in Puerto Rico operational a month after the hurricane. But at the very same time, the government would recommend boiling water, but there was no electricity to do so. So I think this is a very clear example of, once again, in Dorado, in the Ritz-Carlton Reserve, they were recovered in no time. But you still see these situations even today, and it's not nearly as bad today, but you go there and you see the blue tarp shanty towns, and you can go to a village where, they still have a well that it doesn't meet standards from EPA standards, right?
Can I just add something to that?
Absolutely.
So I agree with you. Yeah, when you think of some of the areas in Puerto Rico, you think of like the tourist attractions. So like the single story that we talked about in class, you might only think about those areas, but like, you don't consider the shanty towns or the slums where like the people who are like, really in poverty are still struggling. And I think that's just something that not a lot of people think about or really put enough emphasis on.
Yeah. Another
Olivia,
example of, I was just gonna add on another example of how like people who relied on food stamps in Puerto Rico, I read that the system didn't work. So even though that's how they got their food, like they were already on like the lower end of the socioeconomic status, not being able to get food without a food stamp.
right?
And then they just couldn't even use their food stamps. So it's just another example of
just this circle of poverty that they're being subjected to, right? Because the stores didn't have the systems to take that. So I think we've acknowledged and defined a lot of the environmental injustice, as we've been saying here. Just wrapping things up here, though, how do you guys think this defines systemic injustice? And do you think this is a systemic issue? I mean, between these two hurricanes and these two different areas with two very different cultures, we see a lot of the same problems. I mean, how would you define the systemic injustice here?
I just think it's definitely a result of definitely like systemic injustices, and especially for like Hurricane Ida, which I did more research on. You see a lot of environmental racism, and it's definitely just comes from years of like geographic segregation, especially that we see in the United States, and it definitely happens because of like from the result of corporate powers and elected leaders who take away resources from lesser communities. Like in Louisiana, it's more of like Black communities versus like the wealthier communities. And Black population, like if a community has a higher Black population, they'll be more in danger from like climate change and environmental
Right.
disasters. So.
Absolutely. Thank you for that insight. Anything to add, Emily, before we wrap it up here?
Yeah. When I think of like systemic injustice, like I think of like something that affects an entire system, and clearly these issues are like affecting the entire system of the people of the lower socioeconomic statuses, or the people that are part of minority groups. So I think that's important. when you're looking at something and defining whether or not it's a systemic injustice, which clearly here it is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for your opinions and for your insights on this topic. I really enjoyed talking about this with you. And that's Into the Eye of the Storm, exploring the inequalities in hurricane relief efforts, both in Hurricane Ida and Hurricane Maria.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for listening.